Hey, welcome to part 2 of the exciting Flaming Gorge Geological Road Trip Tour 2023. Now, if you watched the previous video, part 1 of the road tour, you know that I drove along the eastern shoreline of Flaming Gorge Reservoir from north to south, and I went down section from Paleocene to Precambrian. Because you can do that here. There's all kinds of great geology, like you can tell from the stuff behind me. I'll get to that in a minute. I realized if I was going to do a full geological tour of the southern end of the gorge here, it would be a super long video, and I didn't feel like doing that because really, who wants to sit and watch a couple of hours of geological video? I don't. Only a few really sick people would.
I couldn't think of a more horrible job if I wanted to.
And it would be a big hassle to edit, frankly. So I decided to break it into smaller sections. So part 1 of the tour goes north to south, and now you're on part 2 of the tour, which is going south to north on the other side. So I'm going to start down at the dam. I'm going to start in the Neoproterozoic. I keep wanting to call it Paleoproterozoic. It's Neoproterozoic. It's cryogenian, meaning frozen time. The Earth was basically a giant snowball with rocky peaks sticking out. It looked a lot like Antarctica. We're going to go from that really desolate time in Earth's history all the way up to some vibrant times, like the material behind me, which is Triassic and Jurassic rocks, and we're going to wind our way all the way up into the Cretaceous and maybe even younger. So we're going to see a lot of changes in the rock type, fossil type, sediment type, and so on. And I hope you'll come along because I think it's going to be a really good time. If nothing else, there's going to be some great scenery. You can turn down the volume. You don't have to listen to me. I wouldn't want to have to listen to me if I wasn't stuck with myself, but you get what you get. So stick around, enjoy the next few minutes, however long this works out to be, and we're going to go through awesome geology like the stuff behind me here in the Sheep Creek Anticline. With that said, I'm going to get in the truck and go down to the dam, and I will see you there. We're down here by the dam at Flaming Gorge, and as I mentioned in my other video, these really brilliant red rocks that have kind of a purplish tinge to them, these are what gave Flaming Gorge its name. John Wesley Powell called it Flaming Gorge because they looked like they were on fire. And these are Neoproterozoic, Precambrian clastic rocks. And the red color is from iron oxide, where they've been exposed to oxygen at some point in the past. That's not to say they're red beds and paleosols, because they're not. And as I showed you in the other video, there's actually fine-grained material. There's some stuff that looks like maybe tidal deposits, maybe suggesting we're in a delta or an estuary of some kind. There's also fluvial channel bodies, so it's a whole mishmash. It lasted a long time, so we're looking at, tens or maybe even hundreds of millions of years of accumulation. Well, not hundreds, tens of millions of years of accumulation. So a lot of different environments, from fluvial to probably shallow marine, are encompassed in those rocks. That's the Uinta Mountain Group, and it's composed of several formations. So, a lot of time and a lot of environments are wrapped up in those rocks. And I'll show you some after we leave here. I'm at the visitor center, by the way, but I will show you some of these on the drive. We'll stop and look at some of the facies. I did that in the other video as well. We'll check them out on this side of the reservoir. And from here, we're going to work our way up. So this is Neoproterozoic. Earth was a dry, cold, hostile place. Not much living on it aside from algae, cyanobacteria, maybe some little teeny tiny worm-like things, but not much in the way of life. Just like in the other video where I explained that as we're coming to the south, we're actually going back in time. We're actually going to be going forward in time. So we're starting in 700-something million-year-old Neoproterozoic, and we're going to work our way all the way up. We'll stop somewhere in the Mesozoic. I'm not going to get all the way to the Paleocene because the geology kind of poops out. It's not so great anyway. First stop is along Cart Creek, and there's the Cart Creek Bridge, but unfortunately cliff diving here is not permitted. So there go my plans for the rest of the afternoon. But the reason I stopped here is because it's a beautiful exposure of that Neoproterozoic Uinta Mountain Group. And as you can see on the cliff right behind me, there's thick bodies of sandstone. And if you watch the other video, I talked a little bit about what these environments are. By and large, it's a mixed fluvial and shallow marine systems. There's some deltaics, there's some tidal deposits maybe, some tidal flats, some tidally influenced fluvial channels, the works. So it would have looked a lot like one of these big outwash fans in maybe Alaska, where you see these big mountain ranges and coarse grain material coming down and fingering out into the fine-grained tidal flats and whatnot. Except this is Neoproterozoic, so of course there's not much in the way of life other than small algae and cyanobacteria. So it would have looked a lot like Mars, actually. So the Neoproterozoic Earth was cold, Not very lively, a lot like Mars would have been when there was flowing water, so a good analog. But you can see some of these bodies have really sharp basal surfaces, typical of fluvial channel bodies. And they have the coarse-grained facies. And again, if you watch the other video from the other side of the reservoir, I got into more detail on that. I'm not going to do that here because there's a lot more to see. But if you're curious about the Neoproterozoic and the Uinta Mountains group, check the other video because I got into some detail on that. So I'm going to jump in the truck, get going. We're going to cross Cart Creek Bridge, continue on into the mountains a little bit, and then hang north and start working our way up section. Ooh, I'm tingling with excitement. I hope you are too. Wow, things are really taking an interesting turn here. I've just been driving through all that really reddish and somewhat covered up Neoproterozoic, what's called the Cryogenian Uinta Mountains group. And it's called the Cryogenian because Earth was a giant snowball, basically. There was a lot of ice. It was a hostile place. Think Hoth from The Empire Strikes Back, except maybe more rocky outcrops. Less tauntauns and wampas, too. But that's beside the point. The valley right here represents a really distinct change. We've jumped 200 million years into the future. Can you feel it? I mentioned in the other video the faults that line the Uinta Mountains. There's big thrust faults that allow it to thrust up and bring that older material up over younger. There's also a series of folds and anticlines, and we're on the edge of one of those. We're on the limb of what's called the Sheep Creek Anticline. And there are some really awesome stops along the way. There's a geological trail that goes through it. I'm not going to do it this time. I'll do that for a different video, though. But I just wanted to get you looking at this really different lithology from what we saw down at the dam and what we've been driving through on the way from the dam all the way here. We're on Highway 44, by the way. So again, that's the Weber Sandstone, big Aeolian dunes from the Pennsylvanian and Permian, about the same age as the Casper Formation. If you want to check a video on the Casper Formation, I did one of them in Laramie, Wyoming, where there's Aeolian dunes that actually tow out into tidal flats and carbonate deposits. So these dunes were really widespread from here in northern Utah all the way across southern Wyoming at least. I just drove literally a few hundred feet and there's a pullout to show this really, really gorgeous exposure of the fault zone. So I'm going to zoom in on that. I just want to point out why I stopped here. You can see where that car is going by right now. That's the fault zone. And there's Weber Sandstone there and Cryogenian Neoproterozoic rocks there.
Can't refuse the embrace. No.
Check it out, our first glimpse of Flaming Gorge Reservoir coming up the western side. That is Sheep Creek. Really great place to boat, to fish, really popular place. And you can see some of the red beds in it. So we've got still the Weber Sandstone behind me, but there's also some red beds down there in Sheep Creek. That's pretty interesting. So what are the red beds all about? Well, to find out about that, we got to keep going up the road. We got to keep going up section, and we'll see what they are at the next couple of stops. The sun is being really finicky today, so unfortunately this really spectacular outcrop of Triassic and Jurassic deposits is not as lit up as I was hoping it would be. Fortunately, back there it is, and fortunately, down in the lake it is. So we'll have to fill in the blanks in between. But I'm at the Sheep Creek Overlook that was thoughtfully placed here by the Highway Department to stop guys like me from craning our necks and driving off the road to look at this geology. That is, of course, Flaming Gorge Reservoir behind me, and we're looking east, and that is Sheep Creek Bay, which is an epic place to go boating, fishing, water skiing, jet skiing, whatever you like. It was the premier brown trout fishery in the 1970s. For whatever reason, browns got gigantic, like 20, 30, 40 pounds in the gorge. World records were being shattered seemingly like every couple of months, every year. Then in the 80s, it switched over to Mackinaws and lake trout, and the browns just kind of, they're there, but not that you notice. That's a story for a different time, though. In Sheep Creek, we've made a transition from driving along in the Uintas, where we had all that Neoproterozoic, cryogenian, dark purple, brown, red, hard rock, to the Paleozoics. And we passed by that fault where there was the buff-colored Weber sandstone tilted up at a funky angle. Below me here, this is the Park City Formation, which is a marine unit, not like the Weber. This is a marine unit, and it's got lots of phosphate nodules, and phosphate usually comes from dissolved teeth and bones. And speaking of teeth, there's a lot of teeth of a freaky shark called Helicoprion. You might have seen this. They usually show it in documentaries on dinosaurs, or it's in books and all kinds of popular science articles. It's got a big whorl of teeth instead of teeth in jaws. So nobody really knows what this thing looked like, but people usually restore it looking like a shark with a big kind of blunt snout. You need soft tissue, and of course shark skeletons are made of cartilage, so you need really special low oxygen depositional environments to preserve them, and this is not it. So someday somebody will find one, but until then we really don't know what it looked like. That's neither here nor there for this video, though. The sun is just starting to shine on my beautiful outcrop, so that makes me happy. And what I want to point out at this overview is not just that it's really spectacular and stunning and beautiful, but we've got a full section of the early Mesozoic outcropping there on that cliff face. So we've got the Triassic starting in the Dinwoody Formation, which is kind of a reddish buff material at the base. The bulk of the red is the Moenkopi. And the Moenkopi has been interpreted as tidal flats or sort of a brackish water lake deposit or something like that. Then on top of the Moenkopi is a little thin veneer of the Chinle Formation. And Chinle, one of my favorite units, is a combination of fluvial and lacustrine deposits. So rivers and lakes, again, late Triassic. Then something happens at the top. Look at that buff color material. We're back into the sandy color material because it's sand. That is the Glen Canyon group. And the Glen Canyon group includes the Navajo sandstone. It includes a variety of Aeolian, some fluvial, and some shallow marine deposits. Because in the early Jurassic, North America was essentially a lot hotter, drier place than it was prior in the Triassic or later in the Jurassic and Cretaceous. So as a result, there was these big giant dune fields that extended from New Mexico and Arizona all the way through Utah and even up into Wyoming, where the Aeolian dudes would then kind of tow out into shallow marine tidal flats and systems not unlike what existed back in the Pennsylvania Permian, where there was also big tidal deposits at the toes of these gigantic Aeolian dune fields. So sort of a rehash what was happening in the Pennsylvania Permian about 200 million years before. Of course, now that I'm finishing the video, the sun's going to come up. Well, that's okay. We're going to go down there anyway, so I'm going to jump back on the road. We're going to take the road down and around and look at those outcrops up close and personal, and then we're going to cut through. You can see a little bit of a notch up there. We're going to cut through that notch and continue on through the Sheep Creek anticline and see where it takes us. This is kind of fun. The highway department or whoever, maybe Bureau of Reclamation or somebody, has installed these signs giving information on the units I was just talking about. There it is. That's Helicoprion. That guy right there. You can see they've kind of restored it with a funky jaw, sort of a massive underbite. Who knows? But they talk a little bit about the different units, different formations, the types of fossils that were found in them. So that's cool. And then, look at this. In the Moenkopi and the Chinle, they've restored. I honestly don't know what those things are supposed to be. They look kind of like crocodile frogs. I really don't know what they're supposed to be, but they're interesting looking. And there's a phytosaur, big crocodile looking thing, and a small dinosaur representing the Chinle Formation. You know, again, kind of gives you an idea. They've got the background superimposed, so you can see kind of where the Chinle is in relation to everything else. That's nice. And then finally, they talk about the Glen Canyon group and the Navajo sandstone, and they've got the obligatory Dilophosaurus, because everybody knows Dilophosaurus thanks to Jurassic Park. Damn thing ate Newman. But we all know about it now. But that sign gives you a pretty good breakdown of what's happening across the way. Not bad.
Been running so long, I've nearly lost all track of time in every direction. I couldn't see the warning signs. I must be losing it, 'cause my mind plays tricks on me. It looks so easy, but you know, it looks sometimes too sweet. Been running so fast.
Wow, what a nice drive it was down here. I mean, absolutely breathtaking scenery no matter where you look, especially with the fall colors. All the aspens are changing gold and the cottonwoods are changing gold. I mean, it's just, this is my favorite time of year to be out here in the Rockies. So I was just at the overlook, which is up the hill, obviously, from where we are now. We're down in Sheep Creek. In fact, Sheep Creek is down here below me and it runs into the gorge down that way. Behind these beautiful golden aspens is the red stratigraphy of the Moenkopi Formation. That's a Triassic unit that shows up around Moab, shows up around here. It's a very widespread unit, and it's interpreted as being, you know, tidal flats, Sabkha, something like that. Very low energy. There's some fluvial channels, some coarser grain stuff, but by and large it's muddy. The kind of greenish material on top is a little bit of maybe some tan, a little bit of green. That's the Chinle Formation. And the Chinle varies from reddish to pale white to pink to some green. And again, green typically in a soft sedimentary rock like this, a silty, muddy sedimentary rock. And I'm not going to go scrambling up there. You're just going to have to take my word for it. That's what it is here. But that green color, mint green, usually indicates chlorite, which is volcanic ash that's been modified by groundwater. It usually happens in a very reducing environment, so high water table. So that might indicate we had ponds and lakes here in the Chinle. Down around Moab, there's fluvial channels, there's ponds. I did a video on crayfish burrows around ponds that form between salt diapirs. So check out that one if you're interested in the Chinle and ponded water. It's called halokinesis because that's the terminology for salt. But this is a great place to see that early Mesozoic stratigraphy. And of course, I gotta mention the Glen Canyon group, the Navajo sandstone, and the other early Jurassic sand bodies up there, forming this really absolutely incredible vista behind us. And we're gonna drive through it right in that little gap. The road cuts through there, and there's a loop of the Geo Tour trail that goes up alongside it and comes back out above where the viewpoint is. But that's a long, treacherous road. I haven't been there in a long time. And with the great, massive battleship Lithologica, I don't want to have any close calls with sketchy conditions. I had one earlier today, and we don't need to talk about that.
Head over heels, where should I go? Can't stop myself, out of control. Head over heels, no time to think. Looks like the whole world's out of sync.
We are up in the Glen Canyon group in the Jurassic. So we came through the Sheep Creek notch back there, and you saw the sign for the campground, the sign for the geological loop, and I'm in front of what's called the Carmel Formation. So remember, the Glen Canyon group contains a variety of formations, just like the Uinta Mountain group contains a variety of formations. You know, there's, in geological classification, there's all kinds of things. There's members. Those members go together to form formations. Those formations go together to form groups. Groups get together and form supergroups. It's not just a phenomenon in music. It happens in geology too. And I know this is the Carmel. Well, I'm trusting this is the Carmel because this really handy highway sign tells me that. They mention, of all things, they point out that it's got alabaster in a tidal flat. I mean, of all the things they picked out, why that, I don't know. There's a lot of other things you could point out. There's really cool marine trace fossils. There's some little bivalve shells. But hey, whatever, you know, whoever made these signs had their reasons. So I'm going to take a look at the Carmel, see if there's anything worth saying about it. And you're coming with me if you're so inclined. All right, so we saw driving through really big, huge, classic Aeolian foresets in the Navajo sandstone back there. Sand dunes, subaerial sand dunes have really large, high angle foresets. Subaqueous dunes have varying sizes of foresets, and they tend to be, kind of shallower dipping than the really steep dipping Aeolian foresets. So we saw classic Navajo sand. Here, I want something very different. So here's the Carmel. Not a lot of sand. Instead, there's a whole lot of this sort of stuff, which is silty clay. It's not really siltstone. It's silty, but it's like a silty clay stone, silty mudstone. Then there's this. This, to me, looks like some sort of evaporite mineral. So it looks to me like either gypsum or anhydrite or something like that, that formed in a very hot, dry climate in a tidal flat or Sabkha setting. So that makes sense because in the early Jurassic, there's an epicontinental sea. North America flooded multiple times, many times throughout the Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and even into the Cenozoic. So this was the transgression in the early Jurassic of the Western Interior Seaway. It did it again later in the Jurassic. It did it again several times in the Cretaceous. It did it again in the Paleocene. And it looks like from here, there's a lot of covered interval. It's really not very well exposed, but it's all this very fine-grained material. Not a lot of sand, not a lot of carbonate, nothing resistant. So instead of slipping and sliding around, ooh, hey, take a look at that. There's like little thin veins of anhydrites up there, just evaporite mineral beds. So I think we get the feel for what the Carmel is like at this point. So I'm going to continue up the road and see if there's something a little more rock-like instead of this really soft, like almost dust that I'm climbing around on. Wish me luck. I found a good pull-off to look at the Entrada sandstone, which is that big cliff-forming sand up there. It's above the Carmel. So we went from tidal flats to Aeolian, wind-blown sand again, coastal dunes or something like that. And I noticed something interesting with the highway signs here. Like, this one's labeled, but there's a bunch back there that are not. So, for example, they did not label the Navajo, at least not that I saw it. They didn't label the Chinle, so they're kind of random what they do and don't label. There's another one that's completely wrong on the eastern side of the reservoir. I got a video on that, by the way, if you want to take a look at it. So you got to be careful with highway signs. Generally, they're okay, but sometimes either they're just not there or they give you the wrong information. This one actually is correct. That is the Entrada sandstone. It would be a long hike and a steep climb to get to the Entrada, so I'm not going to do that because it's late and I'm lazy. But you get the idea that it's a fairly massive looking sandstone. You do not see the really obvious cross-bedding that characterizes the Navajo. There's that through-going recessive unit in there that's right about there, which could be a marine tidal flat environment, or it could be like an interdune fluvial or pond deposit. There's another one down below it. And it looks like we're about to get some weather coming in, so I might want to wrap this up. I'm going to boogie through the rest of the Jurassic and the Cretaceous and maybe call it a day. I don't want to get caught out here in a lightning storm or something. Well, if you stuck with it this far, thank you very much. We are on the last stop of our monster tour of the western side of Flaming Gorge Reservoir. And I'm going to be looking at what's called here the Dakota Formation, or the Dakota Sandstone. Deposits of a rising sea, because in the Cretaceous there was another flooding event, another rise in sea level, just like there had been prior in the Jurassic, Triassic, and throughout the Paleozoic. So we're going to take a look at these outcrops and see, do they actually correspond to what's described in this short little sign. We are about to see the power of a road cut and why geologists like me love them so very, very much. This is the outcrop of the Dakota as it would appear without a road cut. And you see there's some sandstone sticking out with some scrubby little cedar or juniper tree type things and a lot of talus covering it up. So usually we assume the talus represents muds, shales, finer grain material, and sand represents coarser. But it's really hard to get a read for what exactly the lithology is for a section like this. And if I go across the road, it's the same thing. Look at that. Same deal, it's covered up largely by grass, talus, except for the sandstone. So road cuts are really, really our friend. So we just went from the sand at the base to the claystone, silty clay. Oh boy, another sand. And that one seems to have low angle accretion sets in it, along with some cross bedding. You can see some cross bedding over there. On this side, it's even more pronounced. You can see those large scale cross beds dipping to the north in that direction. So that's an intriguing sand body. Ooh, look at the cross bedding there. Very strongly cross bedded and a sharp contact on that mudstone. All right, very sharp, not gradational, not like something prograding, something incising and depositing. That starts sounding a lot like some kind of channel form. And we don't have a full exposure here, but intriguingly, it goes thick at one end to thin at the other. Look at that, very, very thin. It actually pinches out, it seems like, right up here, so we can get a real good look at it. So part of the apparent pinch out is just there's this talus material under it that's covering up the lower half of the sand body. But you can definitely see there's a change in dips. The dips in this part are all going to the north, but that same sand body, if we follow it off to the right, they're now dipping in that direction. So that suggests we're seeing a three-dimensional bed form that's building that way or this way, and we're seeing the two flanks of it. So we're not seeing necessarily dipping one direction and dipping the other because flow is that way or the other. We're seeing flanks of a three-dimensional dune or bar. So that's interesting. So we've got some three-dimensional bedding features in here on a sharp surface. And there's another sharp surface right up above that on top of this really organic looking shell. I'm calling it organic because it's dark and that's bad. I shouldn't do that. Old habits. But this stuff, it's weathered funny because it's probably got a lot of bentonite. Ooh, that is hard. That's actually, I thought I was just going to be able to grab a chunk of it, and I cannot. Huh. Interesting. Well, that's a lot harder than I thought. So it seems like it's not just a fissile shale. It seems like it's a pretty sand-rich unit that's sitting on top of the cross-bedded heterolithic sand. Look at this. Look at the cross-bedding, and it's pretty coarse-grained. Look at the grain size in there. So that's like medium sand, but it's got these clay drapes or some sort of finer grain draping. Iron oxide is accentuating it, but this is reminiscent of what you see in tidal environments, tidal deposits. So we might be looking at a tidal bar or some sort of compound dune, tidal compound dune. The sort of low angle accretion sets and some of the higher angle accretion sets and the three-dimensional form of this kind of makes me think it might be a tidal bar. So this could be the mouth of a tide-dominated delta, and if we look across the way, that heterolithic accretion could be part of a tidal bar. And I'm saying it's a bar because coarser grain material seems to be giving way upward, up dip into finer grain material. And bars are coarser grain at the base, finer grain at the top. Dunes don't necessarily follow that. So 3D compound dunes can be coarse all the way throughout. They don't necessarily have that gradational characteristic. So maybe a tidal delta mouth bar, and that sharp base scour is consistent with that. That might even be part of a channel system that's been incised and then filled in with a tidal bar. Intriguing and very different from the upper part of the Dakota. On top of our sandy potential candidate tidal bar is another succession, that darker silty sandstone, which is something else entirely. But look at that knife sharp edge with the sand dominated upper part of the Dakota. That is just sharp as sharp can be. And the sand, just like it was down there, is strongly cross-bedded, cross-bedding heading primarily to the north. And there are some larger accretion sets in there as well. Again, giving the feeling of unidirectional flow, not a shore face, not hummocky and swaley. I did a video on the other side of the reservoir looking at a Cretaceous hummocky and swaley wave-dominated succession of sand. This is not that. This is strongly unidirectional flow, consistent with tidal currents. So my interpretation here might be, it's just an interpretation, that that darker material represents the distal part of some sort of tide-dominated delta. That could be the pro-deltaic sand and silt and mud, and then the tidal bars that build out on top of it would have sharp contacts, because again, hydrodynamically, bars have a sharp contact and fine up, but they would be dominated, just like a fluvial bar would be dominated by traction currents. That's the case of these tidal bars. Here's some big cross bedding with awesome little ripples at the top. So we've got large-scale cross-bedding, and then little ripples, and then finer grain material. Typical, again, of a tidal bar where you would have, just like in a fluvial point bar, you would have cross-bedding at the base, little rippled lower energy at the top, and the lowest energy on the tidal flat that might develop. So subtidal, maybe intertidal, intertidal flat, intertidal or supertidal flat. And then it starts all over again. So stacking these guys one on top of the other. This stuff is really weird mineralogical staining. Looks like some sort of iron oxide, some sort of hematite or siderite, but it's forming along these joints, these fractures. Compression fractures would be my guess on this sandstone. Sand, of course, reacts brittly to compression. It doesn't necessarily flex too much. It tends to crack. But look at that. You can see scours in here. There's a scour surface. So pretty dynamic system. Some freaky blue-green mineral oozing out of the rock. I hope it's a mineral. I don't know what it is. I'm not going to touch it. Oh, God almighty. I hate caterpillars. They creep me out like nobody's business. Like, some people are terrified of snakes. Some people hate spiders. For me, it's those little monsters. I hate them. I'm going to get well away from that. But, hey. There's that recessive unit I was pointing to. Here it is better exposed, and you can see there's lamination in it. So some good lamination. Let's take a taste. All right, I broke the piece, so I'm chewing on something from the inside, not something some caterpillar crawled on. I could not handle that. This is, hey, wait a minute. This is clay. This is actual factual clay. It's like the first time ever I've chewed on something that looks fine grain, and it actually is fine grain. Usually like, well, it's kind of sandy. Well, it's silty. This is actual clay. There's a little bit of silt in it, but there's a high proportion of clay. So a tidal system where you've got strong tides going out, strong tides coming in, but a slack period in between, you get these big differentials in grain size, coarse and then very fine, and then coarse and then very fine. Well, sure enough, we've got the sand, and we've got the very fine clay, and then we got more sand, consistent with progradation of a tidal delta, where you have kind of lobe switching and bar switching, and every time that bar is abandoned, because the channel is kind of switched somewhere else, or whatever happens, the bar switches off, then you start accumulating very fine-grained stuff during the tidal cycle. And then another bar comes in because it's either been scoured in or there's been another shift somewhere up the system. So I'm really liking the interpretation of the Dakota here as tidal. Here's something different yet again, though. We're starting to get into something that looks a little more chaotic. And you can see across the way there, look at that material. It's not as rhythmic, not as regular. It looks a little bit more, and the colors, the kind of reds and the greens. So we might be actually prograding a little bit again. Yeah, let's take a look at this. Yeah, so this stuff is very sandy. It looks sort of lenticular, but it's got a lot of iron oxide in it. It's got some yellowish staining, some ochre color stuff, some kind of greenish. It looks a lot like paleosols. It looks like when things are severely exposed. Oh, yeah. Okay, here, look what I just saw. Take a look at the sand above it. I'm trying not to twist my ankle too much. Look at that. That is scoured, and there's coarse grain material in the sand, including rip-up clasts of this stuff. And then 4 sets in the sand. This requires further investigation. We might be up into the terrestrial realm. This might be floodplains, and this might be a fluvial channel. Look at the cross bedding in that. Oh, look at that. Oh, yeah. Look at this. Coarse-grained pebbly sandstone. Okay, that can happen in a tidal system, but the fact that it's associated with what looks like floodplain material below it, and it's scoured and has that coarse grain stuff, I'm thinking we're up in the fluvial section now. So it looks like in the Dakota, we went from sort of pro-deltaic mud down there to tide-dominated mouth bars to up here in the floodplain with fluvial channels and overbank mudstone, alluvial plain mudstone. You can really see the cross bedding here in the upper part of the Dakota, and you can also really see that coarse-grained pebble facies in here. So it's genuine pebbles and granules in amongst the sandstones. This is a pebbly sandstone capping it off with that iron oxide staining that really does look like floodplain. It looks like subaerial exposure. Because, yeah, I mean, look at that. That's pretty cool. Yeah, and just pebbly stringers all throughout here. This is all pebble sandstone in here. Not typical of a tidal system, but typical of a fluvial system. And here at the very tippy top of the outcrop, there's not really much above me, really coarse grain stuff. This is big gravel. So we've gotten out of the little granules, we're into the big gravel. Very coarse grain, probably fluvial. So a full progradational section. So yes, sea level rose back there, but then relative sea level was falling throughout accumulation of the Dakota. So I would modify the highway sign, but I mean, you're trying to catch people's attention as they zip by, you know, supposedly 55, usually it's more like 70 or 80. So you got to keep the wording to a minimum, but you know, it's hard to squeeze in transgression to progradation on one of those signs. So you just say rising sea level. But now you know there's more to the story. Well, off in the distance, you can see the little town of Manila. I think it's pronounced Manila. There's only one L. It's one of those places I've only ever seen written. Nobody's ever said it, so I don't know how it's actually pronounced. So apologies if you're from there and I'm mispronouncing it. You know, shoot me a comment so I know how to pronounce it for next time. But that signifies we are at the end of this geotour of the western side of Flaming Gorge Reservoir. If I continued all the way up to Green River, we'd get all the way up into the Paleocene and even some of the Eocene. But that is a very long drive. I'll save that for another video. It looks like it's going to start storming or something. So, you know, I don't know about that. So again, if you've made it this far, thank you very much for watching. I really appreciate it. Hopefully you enjoyed this. You might have learned something. And remember to get outside, make friends with rocks. You'll be glad you did. And I'll see you next time.